I want to tell you, I heard the most touching story this week. I was listening to the radio. It was a program called Radio Lab. I don't know if you ever heard of it, on NPR. Great program. And it helped me to realize why Margaret Mead knew what she was talking about when she said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. In the story, I realized that small towns can actually be some of the most progressive places on earth. Let me tell you, this is about a small town in Silverton, Oregon, outside of Portland, where they say you can dial the wrong number and still have a conversation because everybody knows everybody else. It's that kind of a town. It's a story about a guy who is a metal worker and a wood worker and an electrician, and he grew up in the town. He was the cable guy for the town for many years. For a while, he used to run the projector at the one movie theater they have there. And at the age of 27, he was in the booth changing the reels for a new movie called The Rocky Horror Picture Show. And he was stunned to see a character in drag singing about being a transsexual transvestite from Transylvania. He'd never heard the word transsexual before, and he says he watched that scene. Oh, you can imagine this guy from a small town going, wow, watching that scene over and over again. Years later, he actually bought and owned the theater, and he was also on the library board. He was a member of the city council in this town, and one day people started noticing that as he was taking tickets for the movie, they noticed that he had been growing his nails out, and then he started painting his nails, and people thought this was really weird. Really weird. And what people in the town say is that the whole thing happened very gradually. After a while, he began to promote movies in the theater by wearing costumes of characters in the film. People began to notice that he was always dressing as the female characters. So, for example, when the new Star Wars movie came out, he dressed as Queen Amidala. Then, when the Big Fat Greek Wedding movie came, remember that movie came out? He wandered around town all day in a wedding dress. And people, at first thought this was a big publicity stunt. But at the age of 52, Stu Rasman began his physical transformation into a woman. You can imagine that when he suddenly appeared one day in his standard issue blue jeans and a flannel shirt, but suddenly with women's breasts, it started turning some heads. And you could hear hushed whispers and louder comments like, "My God, what is he doing?" Kids stopped coming to the theater because their parents said they didn't want them to go there. Groups of teenagers would drive by in trucks and yell slurs. Keep in mind, this is a very small, very conservative town. One member of the town also described it saying, "We have a lot of rednecks," he said. If that gives you an idea of what kind of a town this was. In November of 2008, the town did something that no one ever imagined. It elected Stu as their mayor. The nation's first openly transgender mayor. Now, Silverton is described as a tiny conservative Republican town, and it betrays many stereotypes to realize that the people there would elect him to represent them, a man who wears 4-inch heels, short skirts, and plunging necklines. Keep in mind that many people in the town are extremely religious conservative, and when asked, quite a few members of the town said that they think it's morally wrong, and they don't like it, and they don't understand it, and many of them didn't vote for him. One person said that if Stu had come from out of town, you can bet he would not be accepted here. But this is different, they said. He's a native son. Everyone knows him. People can remember when he was an altar boy at church growing up, and As the cable guy, he's been in everyone's home in the whole town. Apparently, he's still the person that you call if you have a computer problem. So even among the people who are not really happy that he represents them as the mayor, even they say, well, you know, it's just Stu. We all know Stu. And then in 2008, before he was sworn in as the mayor, as the word spread around the country that they had elected a transgender mayor, a group from Kansas that calls themselves a Baptist church, but I use that term very loosely here, descended on the town to protest. They called him disgusting. They carried signs that said, God hates Silverton. God hates Stu. God hates fags. Your pastor is a whore. They even trampled on an American flag to show people how they felt this was a desecration of America, the country, its morality, and our freedom. Well, a few guys decided that they were going to hold a counter-protest. And they dressed up like women and stood across the street. 3 guys. Now, people who drove by were very surprised. And in fact, the town had been asked just to ignore these people. Just let them go away. But soon, hundreds of people from the town came. Men dressed like women, women dressed like men. They had signs that said, God loves Silverton. God loves Stu. People were shocked to see who showed up. A judge, many people who were deeply religious and conservative, grandmothers, teenagers, mothers with babies. Stu, to this day, still can't tell that story without breaking down in tears at seeing this spontaneous response of support after all the years, after all they'd been through, that his community had for him. Now, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. This is not a story about Stu. It's not even a story about transgender or transvestites. It's a story about community. The nation's first transgender mayor, not in New York City, not in San Francisco, but in small-town America. How could that happen? It could happen because they can't demonize him. They know him. He's just Stu. We've watched him all our lives. And that's what's wrong with American politics. Not enough transvestites. That's probably true, but also, and there's probably a lot more than we realize already, but no, my point is, there's way too much demonization of the other side in politics today. We don't really take the time to learn the heart and what's behind different people's political opinions, especially those who don't agree with us. After this recent election, best friends I've been hearing about, they're not talking to each other. College roommates and family members in the same family won't even talk. Not just not talk politics, they won't talk. They hate each other, it seems like. Now this week I also heard an interview about 2 gentlemen who wrote a book. They're friends, and it's a book about how do we get past this divide? How do we learn to talk to one another across our political differences? One of the authors is a conservative Mormon and a Republican, and the other one is a liberal Democrat professor, I believe. And what they said was that they're able to maintain their friendship despite their differences because it begins with respect. They know that the other person is honest and caring and very smart. It's not a question. They respect one another. Now, and they want to listen to each other because they're curious. Why would you think that this is a good idea for our country? Why would you think this could actually help people or be good for the poor or be good for our nation? And it starts with respect and general curiosity. You're intelligent. You're caring. And the funny thing is, each one of them knows that they're right and the other one's wrong. That's not even on the table for them, really. But they just want to know, even though they're wrong, the one thing is that they never think the other person is heartless or stupid or greedy or wanting a handout or bent on destroying our democracy. It just doesn't come up. What these two friends have learned in their relationship is what this church requires of its members. This is a covenanted church, which means that we're not bound together by one belief that we recite every time we get together, we all agree on. It's founded on a promise that we make to each other when we join the church, and we speak it every time we gather and worship, to say, this is how I promise to live my life, and this is how I promise to treat you and to be a part of this community. To seek the truth in love, to dwell together in peace, and to help one another. It's a profound little statement and way to organize one's life and their religious life and their community. Not around everyone has to believe alike, everyone has to think alike, everyone has to be alike. It's about how we care for one another and how we treat one another. When a member of the Helping Souls comes to bring a meal to a member of this church who happens to be shut in at home because of a medical illness or because of age, they don't go ask them, what's your theology? Do you believe in God? What do you think about heaven and hell and all that? They don't ask that. They bring a meal and they care for one another and they befriend one another, because that's what we do. When a member of our care team comes and brings a prayer shawl that's been knitted by members of this church with prayerfulness in every stitch to somebody who's in the hospital, or they bring one of the blankets, baby's blankets and little booties for when a birth of a new baby in our congregation happens, they don't ask those people, now, which service do you attend on Sunday, and do you have a college degree? When the Spirit Song singers from this church go out to somebody's home who is dying, and they circle around their bed and they sing songs from their hearts, they don't ask, now, did you vote for Barack Obama or Mitt Romney? It doesn't come up. And I can never remember anybody coming to me or one of our ministers in a difficult time and we asked them to show their driver's license, or we asked them whether they had a Social Security number. A lot of people don't realize our church board is divided almost equally between Democrats and Republicans, and it's actually been that way almost the entire 12 years that I've been in the church. And yet, no one asked them before they're elected to be on our board what their political party is. In fact, the folks in Washington could learn a heck of a lot from the board of trustees of this church and how they make decisions together and how they learn how to compromise on the important issues of our church. And the reason why we can get along and we can do these things together is because we found this church on high standards and a higher vision. We're based on respect for one another. So when we come into this place, we leave that behind, and we reach to a deeper place of who we are and what our lives are about and what this is all about, and we see the common humanity that we have for one another, and we rise above a lot of the differences that distinguish us when we're outside of this church. Now, this began really early in our church, this idea of people who disagree being together. As a matter of fact, it began with our founders. This church was founded by two gentlemen and their wives, but these two gentlemen who first had the idea to start this church were in deep public and ferocious conflict prior to the decision to start this church. And it was over one of the biggest issues the city was facing. It was, how do we get fresh water into this growing town? This was in 1919, 1920. And we had W.R. Hallway, who was an engineer, who said we need to bring in water from Spavinaw. We need to create a dam and pipe water in from Spavinaw. This is a multi-million-dollar project at an era when that meant something. And the man who owned the newspaper, Richard Lloyd Jones, he thought this was a terrible idea. He wrote these ferocious editorials against it and against its proponent, W.R. Hallway. Well, guess what? W.R. Hallway was right, and he won the argument. We have still half of our water comes from the Spavinaw Dam. But right after that big public dispute was over, these two gentlemen got together and they founded All Souls. because they said a city like this, a growing city filled with lots of conservative churches and lots of different denominations, needed a church dedicated to religious freedom. And they rose above their differences, any animosities that they had, to say, we need a church like this. This is not about our arguments about economics and politics and other things. This is about what kind of church and what kind of city this is going to become. And a city can't develop in a healthy way if it doesn't have folks who are advocating for freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of belief in it. So these guys came together. It's an incredible story, and it's really been a part of this church from its beginning. Like, it's part of the DNA of this church. It always have people on both sides of some of the most significant issues in this city's history. I mean, whether it was, I'm thinking the last one was just a couple years ago. There was a group in this church who were the leaders of an organization that came out. They wanted to change the city charter of Tulsa. And then a group that formed in opposition to that and started their campaign, and they were the leaders of that, were the members of this church too. And there were some intense debates about this, and some of them happened right here in Emerson Hall. And I'm not going to pretend like there wasn't some tension and some strained relationships in the process, but all of those members are still members committed to this church in good standing. And some of them actually, a couple of them work together on another committee and other boards and work for this church, because that's the kind of church this is. What binds us together, it's not our political views, it's not our social class, it's not where we live geographically in the city, it's not even what we believe about God. What holds us together is a vision of the world made better through love and service and through our combined efforts. Never doubt that a small group of people, thoughtful and committed people, can change the world. It's probably the only thing that ever has. Let's talk about a small group of people. There were some many years ago in a small town outside of Jerusalem called Galilee, there was a small group of people that rallied around a man named Jesus. Small group of people that changed the world. It's never been the same again. Small group of people who cared, who believed, who committed their lives, who sacrificed to make a difference because they had a belief in a certain kind of world. Now, there were 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence who changed the history of the world. It's been called the Big Bang in terms of social political realities in human life. This document, the Declaration of Independence, that we've continued to learn how to live into and live more fully. Their signatures and their commitment on that document changed all of our lives and many lives over many, many generations. It was 27 women and men who signed the charter that founded this church in 1921. They were in the YWCA building of downtown Tulsa that no longer exists. And they signed this charter, put their name on there, and committed themselves to building a church. And they changed history too. They certainly changed the history of our lives, any of us who've been positively impacted by this church. And they have even changed the history of this city through the work that this church has done on many important issues, the civil rights movement, women's rights movements, and a number of other things that this church has stood for over the years. But it's not just that. As the largest congregation of our denomination, things that we do here affect sometimes hundreds of the 1,000+ churches, Unitarian churches across this country. And I'll give you one example. We started giving away our collection plate to those in need, to homeless shelters, to abused women, to all kinds of different folks who most needed in our community. That was a decision we made 8 years ago as a church. Well, what happened was there are now hundreds of Unitarian churches all across the country who are now giving away their collection plate. What I'm saying is there are people who are helping to house the homeless, to feed the hungry, to shelter the runaways and the abused children and women all over this country, from Tucson to Tennessee to Tuscaloosa, all over the place, right? From Bozeman to Boston to Biloxi, right? All over cities where there are folks because of a decision that we made here, and that's what it means to be together and to be a church community. And so and even though we can take credit for that, really those people whose signatures are on that framed charter out on the wall, those 27 signatures, they deserve a lot of the credit too, because it's their legacy. It's what they left us and what we've continued to do with what they've left us. Now, in 2010, we came up with a vision statement for this church that's pretty amazing, and a lot of us signed, hundreds of people signed it, and it's hanging out on the wall as well. Is your signature there? I'm just curious, how many people here remember that and signed it? Great. A number of people, there's still a number that could. So we spent a year developing this vision, and it imagines our church radiating a sense of love and welcome and bursting with people of many cultures, colors, classes and creeds, and many philosophies, theologies, and ethnicities of every generation, political persuasion, and sexual orientation. There's no church like that anywhere in the world. It's a bold vision. It's a truly bold vision, and I don't know about you, but I've been having fun as we've been starting to live it out. And we've got 9 more years before our centennial in 2021 to really grow into and live into being such a community in, believe it or not, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The vision talks about us using arts and music to cross borders of understanding, and for us working together for justice and education and religious freedom. Someday, long time from now, future generations will ask themselves, well, how did this church get to be so diverse and so relevant and so unique? And they'll look to that framed vision statement with all these hundreds of signatures around it for the people. They said, wow, they decided at some point this church is no longer going to be just a church that represents one small neighborhood of Tulsa or one small people at Tulsa, but represents all the people at Tulsa. And they're going to give thanks to those folks who have signed that vision statement and that were a part of the church at that time, whether they signed it or not. So today, we're going to give you an opportunity to sign it if you haven't, and I hope you will. Go into Emerson Hall afterward, get some fresh-baked cinnamon buns, and visit with your friends. We got coffee. And we got the history books out there. There's a membership book. If you're ready to join today, talk to Tamara. She's out there by the membership book. Talk to her about joining the church. If you didn't sign the membership book because you've been coming since 2000, sign the membership book. It's really, the signing the membership book is the equivalent of signing the covenant of this church that we say every time we gather and worship. It's the symbolic signing of the covenant. If you haven't done it, I encourage you to do it today. And we're going to do it surrounded by these pictures of our history. And it's pretty amazing. It goes all the way up to Bishop Pearson coming and New Dimensions and David Smith. You'll see pictures of people you know and love in those. Some of you are in those pictures. Check it out. It's quite an amazing history book. And certainly New Dimensions, Pastor Smith, Bishop Pearson have really changed the face of this church and really shaped the vision of where we're going. So I want to take a minute, if you're visiting, I apologize, I just want to take a minute to just talk to the members of the church for a second, and those who attend regularly, our friends and our members, and those watching on live stream, about how do we pay for, keep the lights on in this church, and how do we pay for our incredible staff and amazing guest musicians like Tavis Minner and Jared Tyler and Annie Ellicott and Tommy Poole and these, how do we do this every, especially because we give away the collection plate. So how does this happen? What we do is we budget for the next year. We're doing that right now. In the next 2 or 3 weeks, the Board of Trustees, working with the staff, we're putting together a budget for 2013. We're not like some church. We do not actually base our budget on faith like some churches do. We don't expect a miracle and base our, start spending and then expect a miracle to come in. We base our budget on information. Your information, the information you give us, you say, hey, in 2013, if everything stays relatively the same with my salary and what I'm doing, here's what I'll be able to give to the church. You see the giving guide that's there. We ask people to really strive for 5%. A lot of churches ask for 10%. And the reason that we say 5%, not because we're not as generous as other people in other churches, but we want you to give money to the plate sometimes. There's a lot of organizations that deserve your support in this community, nonprofits and other things. We hope you give to a lot of organizations, so 5% to keep this church going, and we hope you'll do that. And if you're not there, strive to move towards 5%. And some people are doing more. Some people are doing up to 10% or more. So We know that you'll do what you can, and that's what it takes. And now, I know some people always ask, what if my family's had a serious situation, we can't give this year. We understand that. That's what community is, right? Sometimes we need to be carried by our community and say, hey, I can't do it this year, and that's what we show up, and that we help carry you through that. And we carry the church, and we make sure there's a church here in the hardest times for all of us. So if that's your situation, just let one of the ministers know so that we won't continue to bother you with questions, are you a member, phone calls, letters, what's going on, so that we'll know where you are and we'll move forward. But for the rest of us who are blessed to be able to give and contribute to a church like this in our community, we ask you to do your part today. And what better day on Veterans Day to talk about carrying our load, doing our part, being a person that supports the kind of freedom that we believe in and that we entrust and that we count on. And I'll just say lastly, and get back to my regularly scheduled message, that we have not given the staff of this church raises in about 3 years. And it's been a tough economic time. We've kept things going. We've been doing great ministry. And it's amazing that the staff agreed to start a third service, do a lot of things that they're doing without having those increases. Because I know money's not what brings anyone or motivates anyone to be staff in this church. But lack of money could change somebody's idea of, that's a motivator. More money is not necessarily a motivator. Lack of money is a motivator. And if we want to keep the musicians and the guest musicians and the minister team that I've built here and you've helped me build, we need to do that this year. So I'm asking you to please do increase, try to push yourself, move forward to allow us to let this project happen. And so all you need to do is just walk into Emerson Hall in a little bit, and your card's there. It's got your if you've been given to the church any time over the last 5 years, your card will be in there with your name, with the information of what you've given over the last 5 years, so you can look at that for reference, fill it out, hand it in, you're done, and we are so thankful because that'll help us to create our budget. Oh, and the last thing, some people have been asking, are we gonna be asking for money to build a new building? We bought that. We're given that block of land in downtown Tulsa. We're not going to be doing that this year. It's probably going to be 3 or 4 years before we're actually asking folks to start giving money towards that. So that's no excuse not to raise your pledge this year. So please do. We really appreciate it. And let me conclude by saying why I decided to call this sermon United We Stand. Especially at a time like this when our country, some people say, feels like it's never been so divided. But here's what I want to say about what I know about the country that we live in. There's something always right under the surface of all our differences, of all that divides us politically and otherwise. For those of you who are old enough, you remember 2001, September 11th, 2001. On that day, when there were there were bombs bursting in air over New York and Washington, D.C., so to speak, we witnessed countless deeds of heroism and reminders of our fundamental kinship. As the ashes rained down, the people in the towers literally and figuratively became one color, one class, and one faith. As they carried each other down the stairs, as they got on their knees to pray. Our nation on that day was a single family, more united than it's ever been in our history. We saw firefighters rushing into buildings to help, and we witnessed the courage of a small band of passengers aboard doomed Flight 93 who saved the nation's capital or the White House from almost sure destruction. It wasn't that Americans just suddenly became generous and courageous and kind-hearted. It was always there. The spirit of a family, the spirit of people who care about each other, no matter what, in the hardest times and when it really matters. That spirit still exists in our country. It still exists among our people. It still exists in every one of us. It's there. We're ready. If circumstances demand it, we're going to be there for one another. It's just waiting to be brought out by good leadership or by a circumstance that calls us to that part of who we are. And those circumstances will happen again And again, we got a little taste of it when Hurricane Sandy came and we saw people setting aside their differences, working together. Because, you know, when you need food and shelter and socks, these divisions and politics don't make a difference. We'll see it again when it matters. And it's usually a common enemy like the weather or a terrorist attack or like the hateful protesters in Silverton, Oregon, who brought out the best in that community. Our common enemy right now in this country, it's our stubborn refusal to work together to solve our massive problems. That's our common enemy. Our stubborn refusal to really listen to one another and to figure out how we're going to move forward. Let's set aside our special interests. Let's set aside our grievances and work together before it's too late. Now, on a smaller scale, a church is like our nation in the sense that when times are tough, it's nice to have a family around and people who will rally and do anything they can for one another. And that's the kind of church we are. I can remember, I'll never forget, anyone who was here won't forget the summer when we lost 2 small children within the span of 2 months in this church. Everybody was in shock and everybody showed up to do what needed to be done, to care for the families, to care for each other, and to move forward. And everyone got a taste in that time that, you know, it could be me someday. Someday I may need these people, and gosh, it would be nice to have such incredible folks around me, rallying for me, caring for me when I can't even care for myself. So we pull together as a community, and something happens. And it will happen again. And I want us to you know, when I hear about folks they're not even talking to their own family because of politics, they're best friends, they're not friends anymore. We need to rise above that. We need to be bigger than that. That's not the way of this country. It's certainly not the way of this church. Well, unlike the story that I started with this morning, we're not asking any of the men to put on a dress and wear lipstick to support this church right now. Now, I know some of you might like to do that. And the thing is, I know that every single one of you would do that if it meant standing up for the dignity and the rights of somebody you cared about and somebody who you knew was being treated wrong. How do I know that? I know that because you'd give the shirt off your back for somebody in a situation like that, and you have, probably multiple times. Today we're not asking for the shirt off your back. Today we're not asking you to get in a dress or for the women to put on a tie. Not today anyway. All we're asking you to do is just take 30 steps towards Emerson Hall, pull out a card. If you don't have one, if you haven't been given, your name's not on one, we've got some blank cards. Fill it out, support the church, click online if you're listening to a podcast or one of our live streamers. Support the church. Help us keep being the church we are, because it makes our lives better, and it makes our city better, and it makes our world a better place. I know that you'll do what you can. I trust you to do what you can. I bless you. I thank you. And I don't say this lightly. I love you. Amen.